see a town, a view from the road coming into a town, is that ubiquitous New England church. Steeples go back a long, long time in history. They go back, in fact, to pagan times. Steeples are around in medieval times in Europe, and particularly in England. There's all the churches have steeples, but they don't necessarily have spires, and that's one of the big differences. The spires do show up in some cathedrals, Salisbury, for instance, in England. What we call and consider the New England style, that came into being in the late colonial period, early federal period, when we had all of the ferment and the revolution. We broke off from England, and the churches then that were built in what we call the federal style. And they almost all had spires. Now, this church didn't have a spire at one time. The original building was a meeting house. This was usually what they called them. Way back where I'm from in Ipswich, the first meeting house was in 1634. Simply a pretty square, simple building. That, by the way, would have been a colonial style because those happened during the colonial period. Then finally in 1836, when this church was built, they were able to build a Federalist style, and with the same windows that we have here now, the same structure, had a small tower on top of it with no spire, and that housed the bell. And that bell was important for the town for a variety of reasons. It was important to call people to church. It was also important if there were fires, the bell would be ringing crazily, and that would alert the town that there was some kind of catastrophe. So that was a bell tower was part of a church structure from before the Middle Ages. There is a romantic idea that the steeples represent, our reaching for God or for the heavens or whatever, and that anecdotally has been part of the lore of steeples. Whether that was part of the original idea of steeples or not, it could have been. I don't think there's any documentation for that. Our church has three sections to the steeple. There's the spire, the belfry, which is where the bell is housed, and then there's what's called the lantern. And below that, there's a section of tower which supports it all. Okay, so there are four sections to that construct. The First Baptist Church in Providence has 8 or 9, it's hard to tell, sections to their steeple. And it's wonderful, and it's been there since 1775 or something of that way back then. And it's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful steeple. My dad was a structural engineer, and I've sort of followed in his footsteps. In 1952, we had a hurricane, I think 53, Hurricane Carol. That toppled part of the steeple in Providence. My dad was called in as the structural engineer to rectify that. And he explained to me the principles behind steeple design in 1953.
Is that right?
Isn't that cool?
That is cool. That is great.
Asher Benjamin, who was a very famous architect who lived from 1770-something until 1846, I think. And he is the one who developed and published books that showed how to construct federal type, and other later type architecture, including churches and church steeples. So it's a wonderful resource for this kind of stuff. The trick, or the structural brilliance of how to construct a steeple with, in this case, 4 different parts, including the tower, which supports the 3 above. We have 2 forces. One is wind, which wants to topple the steeple. The other is load, vertical loads, which wants to compress what's supporting it from below. The most interesting one, of course, is the wind. How does the steeple resist the wind? So the spire, which is the very top, is hexagonal in shape, by the way. And that spire, on the edges of each of the hexagon, the points of the hexagon, the members come down below the spire into the next section, which in our case is a belfry, and is attached to the belfry down almost, I believe, to the floor of the belfry. Then the belfry is the next unit, and that also is hexagonal. And that has members that come to posts that come down on the sides of the belfry. And instead of stopping at the lantern, which is the next section, they go down into the lantern. So as you see, with the wind wanting to push over the spire is connected to the next section, and the next section is connected to the one below. So they all work as one. If they stopped at each one, if there was a plane at each one had its own plane, it would tend to shear off at that point. But they're down into the next section. In fact, they're all connected all the way down to the tower. And that's the way it's what I call nesting, but that's the way in which the wind load is resolved on the steeple. The steeple has some deterioration and rot because of the elements, basically dampness, wet. The same effects of weather that you have on a house or any other structure. It's particularly vulnerable in a steeple, but we're fortunate there doesn't seem to be any structural damage at all. It's really just, and that is just a matter of the force of the wind is great. It gets it from all directions, and it hasn't affected the structure at all. However, the exterior skin, if you will, needs to be completely replaced. If not replaced, the structure will soon be compromised. The work will require scaffolding to be erected on all 4 sides. New windows, new louvers, copper flashing, PVC cladding, and composite shingles will be applied, as well as new rubber roofing on the floor of the belfry. In short, all new surfacing on the spire, belfry, and the lantern. The steeple was erected in 1879 and had major repairs done in the 1940s, 70 years later. That is now 70 years ago. As good stewards of the building, it is our turn to ensure that this grand steeple will be in fine shape 70 years from now. it is, of course, true that the New England church, with its steeples, this particular style, does engender a feeling of a feeling of comfort, a feeling of I'm home.